Hello and welcome. My name is Nikhil and in this video we're back for module 3. And in this lesson we're going to talk about the basics of sound designing. So what is sound designing? If you remember in our previous lessons, we took the sounds from our categories and directly loaded it onto the tracks. And then for the various sections that we composed, we didn't think once about changing the way that sound worked. It was just the same sound all along through the intro, through the verse, and through the main section. But what if, for the main section, I wanted the sound to be a little bit different or a little bit more dynamic and expressive than it was for the intro section? I wouldn't know how to go about it. There are so many knobs within the instrument in our device view. So the sound designing is the art of understanding how these instruments work, how we can manipulate and shape our sounds the way we want them to do. So let's go ahead and start learning about sound designing. There are two approaches to sound designing. One is called as synthesis and the other one is called as sampling. Synthesis is the art of creating and shaping sounds using pure audio waveforms. And sampling is the art of creating and shaping sounds using pre-recorded audio material. So now, before we go any further, I'd like to show something that I made in Ableton Live using synthesizers and samplers. So let us take a look at that. So alright, so what you're looking at is a musical section that I made using synthesizers and samplers. So I'm just going to solo and walk through each of these tracks. So here, this was done with a synthesizer, and the synthesizer is called as operator, and we'll be talking more about this as we go along this course. This harmony section was also done using the same instrument, the operator. And so was this bass instrument. And over here, I have the drums. This was sourced from an already existing drum section, but I reworked it to create my own drum beat. So this is an example of sampling. And this is in fact my voice. I've turned my voice into an instrument. And this is also an example of sampling. So now let us take an empty project and look at how we can create these things from scratch. So let's get started. Let's start with synthesis. Synthesis is done using instruments called as synthesizers. And there are two types of them. We have hardware synths and we have software synths. Now for this lesson, we are going to be looking at making music using a software synthesizer called operator, like the one I showed you in the previous example. Now let's understand a little bit more about synthesis. So we can understand synthesis by understanding three concepts: waveforms or wave shapes, harmonics, and our ADSR envelopes. So let's start with wave shapes. So wave shape is what defines the source of the sound, and we have primary waveforms or wave shapes like sine waves, triangle waves, square waves, and so on. Now let's get on to harmonics. If you think of a guitar and a piano, let us say you're playing a C note on the guitar, and let's say your friend is playing the exact C note, the same pitch on the piano. What is the difference between these two sounds? So now, if we understand sound in terms of frequencies, every type of sound or every type of instrument has something called as fundamental frequencies and harmonic frequencies. So the difference between a guitar and a piano sound is basically the distribution of levels between these fundamentals and harmonic frequencies. So this is what defines the harmonics. Lastly, let us talk about our ADSR envelopes. Now these ADSR envelopes define the behavior of a parameter over time in a very node-dependent way. Now ADSR envelopes define these parameters over a short period of time, unlike automation, which define parameter behaviors over a long stretch of clips. Now let us get into Ableton Live and start building a harmony using the operator. So I'm going to come into my categories and browse through the instrument section, and within the instruments you're going to find the operator. Just click and drag it onto the track, and there we have it. Now this is operator, a digital synthesizer native to Ableton Live. Now, to build out the harmony sound, firstly let me just right click, rename this as the harmony. Now to build out the harmony sound, I need to keep a few things in mind. Firstly, I need to define my waveforms. So what I'm going to do is, within my clip, let me just have a chord playing. So I'm just going to put together a C major chord. Let's stretch that out. And now within the operator, you can see these 4 different shells. Now these are called as A, B, C, D. These are my oscillators. So this is oscillator A, oscillator B, oscillator C, and oscillator D. Why am I talking about oscillators? Because using the oscillator, I can define my waveform. So in oscillator A, you can see that in the middle section, I have something called as the wave, and with this drop down, I can choose my waveforms. So let us try putting a saw wave. This is a square wave. The numbers next to each of these waves define the number of harmonics. So you can hear the saw 3 sounds a little bit milder compared to, let's say, a saw 64. And you can see your harmonics listed out here as well. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have sine wave as my A oscillator, and within the second oscillator I'm going to introduce, say, saw 16. But you can't hear it yet, because for each of these oscillators we also have to take care of the level knob. And as you can see, for oscillator B, this is at -infinity. That means there's no sound affecting my synthesizer. So I'm going to just slowly increase this. And now you can hear some drastic change in the character of the sound. The next thing that I can look at is my coarse parameter, because this is going to define the relative octaves or the relative harmonics between my oscillators. So let me just move that about. And using this also, we can get some kind of different flavors between our oscillators. I'm going to leave it at 2. Now the next thing we need to look at is the ADSR envelopes. So within my oscillators, you can see that in the central section, I have this envelope button. And when I click that, I can look at this, sort of a line. And what does this line do? You can see below that we have the attack, the decay, sustain, and release. Now this is ADSR. This is the ADSR envelope I was talking about earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a little bit of attack, and I'm going to talk about what this means. So you can hear that the sound is swelling up, right? This is because I have given an attack time of 1 second, and what this means is the sound is going to take 1 second to fully ramp up in volume. I'm also going to do another thing. I'm going to stretch out my notes a little bit more longer. Now let us talk about the decay value. I'm going to keep playing the sound. So as you can see, I'm changing up my decay, but it's not really affecting my volume, or it's not really affecting the sound in general. This is because decay talks about the time taken to go from my peak value to the sustain value. And what is the sustain value? As you can see, the sustain is at 0 dB. I'll try lowering that. And I'll try lowering the decay now. So you can hear that the sound abruptly stops at the end as soon as it reaches the peak. That is because I've reduced my decay and my sustain is all the way to -infinity dB. So let me give a little bit of sustain. Now the next thing to talk about is the release value. So if you notice, in my clip, I have some empty space. So you can imagine me playing a chord and releasing my keys by lifting my hand. So this is the note off point. Now over here, if I start increasing my release time, you get that smooth trailing off of the sound, right? The sound doesn't abruptly die off, but instead you have this very smooth fading out and fading into the next sound. So you have this very nice ambient thing going on here. So to work out my harmony, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep slow attack and slightly high release. And let me work out some 4 chords or a progression of 4 chords. So I'm going to increase my clip length. And going to increase my clip length again. Let me just adjust the zoom settings so I can see things clearly. Okay. I'm going to duplicate this chord 4 times. And now let us switch on the scale. I'm going to set the A minor scale. That is A and that is minor. And now let me just move around these other chords to different positions so that we have a chord progression going on. That is there. I think this is doing a D minor and this is doing an A minor. Okay, I have 2 A minors, which is fine. So let us just play this out. Okay, it's a little too fast for what the character that I built over here, because the attack is like 1 second long and the release is 2 seconds. So my chord progression is like super fast. Let me lower the tempo a little bit. And also let me stretch out this clip. Like let that attack and release breathe, right? So bear in mind that the ADSR I just worked out was for the volume parameter, and we can have ADSR for multiple different parameters and it changes from synthesizers to synthesizers. Let us now try adding a bass instrument. So I'm going to do the same thing. In my second empty MIDI track, I'm going to go to the instruments, take another instance of operator and load it. And let me rename this as bass. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to copy my harmony very quickly, and I need notes that work with the harmony, right? So I'm just going to deactivate my thirds and fifths and have sort of a rhythmic melody going on for the bass. And just have this first note just repeating. So notice that me doing this is also letting the bass add to the rhythm of the overall composition. And usually bass does that in a lot of different styles of music. So let me play this. Okay, so right now it doesn't sound anything like a melody. Sorry, it doesn't sound anything like a bass. It's sounding more like a melody. So what I can do is I can come into my synthesizer, and the first thing I can do is let me just click on this transpose where it says 0 semitones. Remember, this is a similar thing that we saw in audio clips. We had a transpose button. So I'm going to hit shift down arrow to shift it lower. And now it sounds a little bit more like bass. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce my second oscillator. And I'm going to drop the chorus. And now it sounds a little bit deep. Now there's a lot more we can do with synthesizers, and there's a lot of different functionalities within synthesizers. We don't have the time to get into all of this. So here the whole idea was just for you to get a sense of what is happening in synthesis and how we can apply certain basic aspects of synthesis. You saw how easy it was for me to work out the harmony section and the bass section using the operator. Now that's the thing about synthesizers. Once you understand the concepts of synthesis, it's very easy to create different types of sounds, different types of instruments. And the next time you hear your favorite song and you find a layer that you really like, with the power of synthesis, you just might be able to mimic it. Now let us talk about sampling. Sampling is the art of using pre-recorded audio for musical expressions. Now imagine you went to your friend's house and is playing drums. and you like what is playing and you just record it. Now you can come back to your house, open your Ableton, upload that file into Ableton Live, and you can chop up that clip or that audio recording and turn it into your own to work for your project. Now this is the power of sampling. Let us now look at recording a sample directly into Ableton Live. So as you can see, or as you can now see, I have a microphone in my hand. Now this microphone converts the physical vibrations in the air into electrical signals, and those vibrations travel through this cable which is called as the XLR cable, and this XLR cable is connected to something called as the audio interface. Now what is an audio interface? Audio interface is a device that converts my electric signals coming out of the mic into signals which the computer or Ableton Live can recognize, digital signals, ones and zeros. Now within Ableton Live, if I open the preferences again using Control comma or Command comma, I can get into this audio tab, and here I can choose this audio interface. As you can see, it says Audient USB audio driver, and the interface I'm using is Audient. And once that is done, I can close that and now come on to the audio track, and I can set this up within the audio track. So within the audio track, you see audio from, and it's set to external input, let it be there, and within that you have to select which channel your mic is connected to within the audio interface. So I'm going to speak into the mic, and you can barely see some signal happening within channel 1 because that is where I have connected my mic. Now I want to increase the signal because the signal is not sensitive enough. My mic is not picking up enough. So what I'm going to do is turn my gain knob up. Now this is the gain sensitivity knob which increases the amplitude coming out of the microphone. Check, 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 hello, hello, testing. And you can see that the signal is rising up there, right? You can see within that small box next to 1. So I think I've set my gains enough. Let us see how we can record the signal. Now over here, just like how we did with the MIDI tracks, I need to record on my track. So I'm gonna hit this red record button, and now immediately you can see the signal popping up in my volume indicator. But you cannot hear it, and it's grayed out. So what I need to do is monitor my signal to be able to hear what I'm trying to record. So for that, I'm going to change my monitor to auto. What this means is that every time I hit my record button, it will automatically start letting me monitor my signal. So check, check, check. Now I'm able to hear the signal as I'm speaking. So now I could do a recording. Or to do a recording in the session view, it's as simple as hitting on one of these black buttons. So I want to record into the first scene. So I'm going to hit this button. So what I just did is record a single note, right? Let me just play that back. And if I open the clip view, you can see the clip, it's a little soft, so I'm going to increase the gain. But before you continue working further, it's a good idea if you're done with the recording, just make sure that you drop the gain again, just so it doesn't feedback from your speakers. So now what we'll do is we'll look at how I can turn the sample into a melodic instrument using a sampling instrument within Live. So if I come over to my categories within the instrument section, you can see something called as a simpler. Now this is a sampling instrument. I'm going to drag and drop it to this empty area, and it automatically creates a MIDI track. Now remember this, we are working with audio, but I'm not going to load an audio track to work with my sampling instrument, because at the end of the day, these sampling instruments are still MIDI instruments, and they need MIDI commands to talk to these audio files. So I have my simpler loaded here. The next thing I'm going to do is drag my audio file and drop it onto the simpler. And as you can see, the audio file is now inside the simpler. I'm going to rename this because it's given a very weird name depending on that file name. I'm going to call this melody. and let us have a clip playing. So I'm just gonna put the root note a couple of times and let that play. You'll notice that the MIDI clip is playing, but you're not hearing because the starting point is way off. As soon as the MIDI note starts playing, it triggers the clip within the simpler, but it just didn't get far enough to play it. So I'm going to move the starting point. Okay, so now I can hear the sound. An interesting thing about simpler is you need to place the sound in the C3 note to hear the original sound. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to shift this lower to be on C3. Alright. And now let me increase the gain within the simpler. So now I need to calibrate the instrument, right? So for that, I'm going to use something called as a tuner, which I can find in my audio effects. So I'm going to come into my audio effects. I'm going to go into utilities and select the tuner and drop it. So bear in mind that tuner is an audio effect, but it doesn't really affect the sound in any way. It just tells you what that note that the audio signal has. So I'm going to play this. And let me make a longer note. So I found a spot within my recording where you can see this ball is not moving around too much. It's more or less still. So I'm going to go with that position and I'm going to adjust the stopping point. And you notice that the signal stops once it reaches the stopping mark. So I'm going to switch on the loop. And now it loops on top of the note for however long the note wants to play. Now when you listen to this playback, you can hear that slight clicking, glitch sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to alter the length of my loop and find a spot where I no longer hear that clicking sound. So now it feels like it's looping a lot more smoothly. Let me just increase the volume. Yeah, so I think this is good enough. So the next thing what we need to do is tune the sample. So I'm going to come into my control section, and before I do anything here, let's understand what we have to tune. So if you look at this tuner, you can see that the note is C, but it is not exactly at the dead center. It's a little off in terms of cents. And what is cents? You can say 100 cents is equal to 1 semitones. It's more or less like 100 centimeters make a meter. So my tuning is off by 10 to 15 cents. So I'm going to come into my control section of my simpler and detune it in the negative direction. So let us say minus 13. Let me reduce that slightly less. So now you can see that the signal is more or less within the green, which means you can work with that. And now let us make a melody. So note that I'm in the A minor scale, so I have to make sure that my melody lies in the A minor scale. So another thing to note is, since my node is calibrated, now all the notes will refer to the actual pitches correctly. So here I'm not going to follow that process what we discussed in the first module for creating melodies. If you're confused about making melodies, that would still be a good thing to practice. Alright, so this is good enough. So now that I have my melody, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into my simpler and start looking at the ADSR. So if you come to the control section, this is the sample section, this is the control section. You can look at an ADSR control here, and this is basically talking about the volume control ADSR or the amplitude envelope. So I'm going to lower the sustain a little bit and increase the decay. And also increase the release. And make it a little bit more bellish and grand. Let me also increase the output volume. And let us play along with the rest. Now that sounds pretty nice. The last thing what I'm going to do is work out a drum section, and for this I'm going to use an audio clip which is already present within my Ableton library. So I've already marked it under favorites, and if you're confused about how to work your things into collections, we have discussed that in the previous class. So the sample what I need, I think this is the one. So for this what I'm going to do is, it's easier to work this out in the arrangement view. So I'm going to take this sample and drop it onto this empty area. It automatically creates an audio track. Let us play that back. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create small slices by selecting areas and hitting Ctrl E or Command E format to make a split. And I'm going to do that regularly. So what I'm doing here is, I'm creating sample chops of my larger clip. Now I'm going to add a new MIDI track with the shortcut, and I'm going to come into my instruments and load a drum rack. Now what I can do is, I can take each of my individual sounds and directly drop it onto the drum rack. If this drum rack looks familiar, it's the preset we have always used while we were making sounds or making music in our last couple of lessons. And we used to find them under the drums category. But here, we are creating a drum rack from scratch. It's soloed. I'm going to unsolo that. So I'm going to start placing each of these chops onto different positions within my drum pads. Alright, so I think I have what I need. Okay. So now what we are going to do is, we are going to start stitching together a new drum pattern from that drum pattern. And for that, I'm going to create a clip here in the session view. And as you can see, you just see this name GF full drums, which was the name of that clip. So what I'm going to do is quickly rename these individual hits. I'm going to call this kick, call this hats 1, I'm going to call this snare. So to rename, it's the same shortcut, Ctrl R or Command R. Call this hats 2, kick 2, open hats. Let me call it. Now that we have named our individual parts, let's go and build some drum patterns. So I'm going to switch over to my session view. And let's start by doing a 4 on the floor pattern. The snare on every alternate beat. And let me do some hi-hats on the 16th. So I'm going to disperse between the two types of hi-hats I have. And I think towards the end, let's also add an open hi-hat and see how that sounds. So I'm going to remove the solo button. Also what I'm going to do is, I'm going to add a couple of snares towards the end to work sort of as a closing filler. And maybe let's move this as well to open. Alright, so let's listen to that all together. rearranging my tracks. Alright. There you have it. We have built a musical section from scratch using synthesizers and samplers. For my harmony and bass, we worked it out through our synthesizers, and then we recorded a vocal sample through the mic, through the audio interface, to work out a sample which went on to become a musical instrument. I played my melody on that, and then finally we took a drum clip and worked out a new drum groove by resampling it. And there's a lot more that goes into sound designing. And if you'd like to learn more with me, be sure to check out my live online masterclass on music production. And while you're on the platform, be sure to start exploring the platform, because there's a lot of producers, artists and trainers on the platform. Engage with the community, share your questions, doubts, share your music with us. We'd like to hear what you're working on. So thank you for watching. Happy learning and be creativity.